Hey everyone, hopefully it's not too late for a 2021 wrap up, but I want to do one right now. So I want to share with you out of the 106 books that I read this year, my top genres of the year, my top authors of the year, and then talk about all of the books that I rated 5 stars this year. So if you haven't seen many of my videos, this is probably a good place to start because you can see the kinds of things that I tend to read, the authors that I tend to read most, the genres I like to pick up the most, and then I'll talk about the books that I like most. So this might be a great video for those of you that haven't seen much of what I've done here on BookTube. Hey, sorry for the gravelly voice during this video. I just gotten over having the virus that shall not be named. I had a really scratchy throat for like a week, but I really wanted to talk about these books. So if I sound kind of monotone and gravelly, my apologies, but hopefully the content will surpass the poor sound of my voice. But thanks for watching. If you do like this video, please give me a like and subscribe. As always, you can hit the little bell icon to get a notification anytime I upload a video. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads for more in-depth reviews than I often do here on these videos. So breaking down my books by genre, you can see that I read a lot of fantasy genre this year, over 40 books. And then my next actually four genres, science fiction, historical fiction, nonfiction, and thriller, all between 10 and 20 books, so a lot of those. And then I read about 5 classics and then 4 or 5 that didn't fit into these categories, but that's kind of a rough breakdown. My favorite genres subjectively would be fantasy, historical fiction, and science fiction in that order. Now, a quick breakdown of the authors that I read most this year. Starting with Brandon Sanderson. I read 10 books by Sanderson, which you see on the screen. The two not pictured on the screen are the novella Dawn Shard and the prose version of White Sand. And I enjoyed reading Sanderson. If you don't know Sanderson, he is maybe the undisputed king of the fantasy genre right now. He writes very quickly and he is consistently very, very good. The next author that I read quite a bit this year is Bernard Cornwell. You see the 7 books on the screen that I read by Cornwell. Cornwell writes historical fiction, and he writes the kind of historical fiction that leans into kind of action and adventure. And his books are always very, very fun to read. And I enjoyed kind of 3 different settings in the 7 books that I read by Cornwell. And I enjoy Cornwell, and he's one of my favorite historical fiction authors. Coming in at 6 books, Frank Herbert, who has fast become one of my favorites in the science fiction genre. I absolutely love Dune. I'll talk about that later in the video. And its 5 sequels were the 6 books that I read by Frank Herbert this year. Joe Abercrombie is another new-to-me author from last year, and he is called Lord Grimdark because he writes fantasy of a grimdark slant. And you see that I read the 3 books in the First Law trilogy and then the 3 standalone novels, which also occur in that world. Also coming in at 6 books is Robin Hobb, another author who has fast become one of my favorites. I read the Farseer trilogy and the Live Ship Traders trilogy. Hobb and Abercrombie, they're both 2 of my favorite new authors and 2 of my favorite authors, period. Coming in at 5, you see this big omnibus edition of Robert E. Howard's Tales of Conan the Barbarian. I enjoyed reading all of these last year. I also read the last 4 books of Roger Zelazny's 5-book Chronicles of Amber series, and I'll talk about that 5th book when I talk about my favorite books of the year. And also coming in at 4 books, actually 5 books, is my favorite author, Stephen King. So 2 of these were new this year. That was Later and Billy Summers. 2 of these were older works that I had just not read, The Institute and On Writing, and Hearts in Atlantis was a reread for me. So those are the 5 works of Stephen King that I read this year. All right, as I talk about the individual books that I gave 5-star rating to, what does a 5-star rating mean? So for me, 5-star rating simply means that I loved it. It doesn't mean that it's a perfect book, but these are books that I just simply, from a reader standpoint, absolutely loved, and I gave 5 stars. So I'm going to group these by genre. So I'll put timestamps below if you just want to skip to a specific genre, and I'll use the genre breakdowns that I used in the graph that you saw at the beginning of the video. All right, I'm going to start first with Brandon Sanderson and The Way of Kings. So The Way of Kings is the first book in Sanderson's planned 10-book series called the Stormlight Archive. And 4 of those books are completed, and I believe he just started writing the 5th book, so I eagerly await whenever that comes out. This is a fantastic series, but I think the only one I gave a 5-star was Way of Kings, although the 2nd and 3rd books were pretty close. Way of Kings presents this very, very compelling world, and it showcases everything that Sanderson does well. The world building, the magic system, which is always so interesting, and when he does it well, it just raises the stakes in his stories. And the characters, my goodness, these are some fantastic characters. In this one, we get to follow one such character called Kaladin through most of the book, and we see his backstory, and we follow him through this 1,000-page book that is just tightly plotted, brilliant ending, and one of the best, if not the best, first books of any book series I've ever read. So, Brandon Sanderson. Of the 10 I read, this is the only one I gave 5 stars. There were a lot of 4 and a lot of 4.5 in my rating scale, but Way of Kings got a 5-star. But I do want to mention one other work by Sanderson. He wrote a book called Arcanum Unbounded, which is a collection of his shorter fiction. And within that collection, there's a novella called The Emperor's Soul that I think is Sanderson at his finest. It's a novella set in the world of one of his other books called Elantris, but it showcases everything that Sanderson does well in, about 90 pages. Great character, great world, fantastic plotting, and I was just shocked when I got to the end how much I cared about the main character, and I think it's Sanderson at his finest. If you want to see me talk more about Sanderson, I did a tier list of all the Cosmere that I read in the last year and a half, so you can check out that video as well. But Way of Kings and Emperor's Soul both got 5 stars for me this year. I want to talk next about the last book in Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber, called Courts of Chaos. So the 5 books in the series really are one continuous tale. I've said before that I think of the Chronicles of Amber as epic fantasy in disguise, because you have 5 books that are all about 200 pages, but it is one continuous narrative, one continuous story, and I really enjoyed the ending of this. I enjoyed this world quite a bit. I see a lot of mixed reviews when you see people talking about Zelazny's work, and I can see where both sides come from. I understand the people that think that this is some of the best fantasy ever, and I can also understand the people that don't connect with it. It's a very different kind of storytelling, very different kind of prose, but I really enjoyed this series, and the last book in the series is, I think, a very fantastic conclusion to this 5-book arc. If you want to know just briefly what it's about, it's kind of a low fiction story where our protagonist wakes up in our Earth and starts to remember his past life in this magical world of Amber. And the story goes from there, and it hops between the 2 worlds. And I think it's just finally told, and I really enjoyed it. Courts of Chaos, I gave 5 stars this year. Up next is Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. And this is the 3rd book in his First Law trilogy. So by extension, I gave the First Law trilogy a 5-star rating. I loved it. It started maybe a little slow. The 2nd book, plotting, is the reason I didn't give it a 5-star. But in this book, I think it all came together so well. All of the key characters, what their motivations were doing. I'm always fascinated with how his characters drive the plot, and it's such a fascinating thing. It is almost as if you hear this cliche from writers where they say, oh, I just create the characters and watch and see what happens. I really feel that with Joe's writing, because the characters often drive the plot into such different directions than you would typically see it go. And I think it is because he lets the characters kind of drive the bus, so to speak. I found Last Argument of Kings a fantastic conclusion of the First Law trilogy. It doesn't end the way you might not want it to end or the way you think it'll end, but I think it is an ending, and I think it's a fantastic ending. And I was immediately a Joe Abercrombie fan after reading this book. The other book that I gave a 5-star rating to by Joe is Best Served Cold. And this is a fantastic revenge tale. This is a standalone novel. You could read this by itself. It probably works better if you have read the First Law trilogy and you understand the world a little bit, but you could read it by itself. This is essentially, I imagine if Quentin Tarantino placed Kill Bill in a fantasy setting, this is what would happen. You have, on the cover, you see Monza Mercado, the Snake of Talons, and she is betrayed, and she basically, through this whole book, enacts revenge upon the people that betrayed her in some very gruesome fashion. It's a fantastic tale. My favorite of everything I've read by Joe. I've read the 6 that you saw on the screen earlier in the video, and then this year in 2022, I started the year with Sharp Ends, which is his short story collection. Of the 7 things of his that I've read, Best Served Cold stands at the top. I think it is one of the best revenge tales I've ever read, as well as just one of the best tales that I've read in the fantasy genre. And it's nice that it's a standalone. We have, 5-book, 10-book series, trilogies. It's nice to have a standalone novel that works so well in this genre. Okay, up next is another one of the authors that I love so much, and that's Robin Hobb. I read 6 by her this year. The first 5-star rating I gave was Royal Assassin, which is the second book in her Farseer trilogy. And the Farseer trilogy is 5 stars as well, but Royal Assassin is the book of the 3 that I enjoyed the most. What I love about the Farseer trilogy is the character Fitz, in 3 books, became one of my favorite literary characters ever. And I'm not even done with him. I know that he is in the Tawny Man trilogy, which I'm about to start later this month. And he's also in the Fitz and the Fool trilogy, which I'll read later this year. So I can't wait to see the trajectory of this character's life, because it's, in the Farseer trilogy, it's a brilliant coming-of-age tale as we meet Fitz when he's about 5 years old, and we see him into his early 20s in that trilogy. And Royal Assassin, it's odd for the middle one to be the best book of the trilogy, but I think it was. Not that the first or third books were bad, although there were some plotting issues, I think, and maybe some narrative thematic choices in the third book I didn't totally love. I love the series as a whole. So Royal Assassin is a 5-star book. Farseer trilogy is a 5-star series. More by Robin Hobb. I gave each book in the Live Ship Traders trilogy 5 stars. This was such a great series. And what I said when I talked about this, and I don't want to talk too much because I still want to do a full review of this trilogy. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. What I love about this, and it just shows how great this series is that I don't like the setting. Like the open seas and, sailing and ships and all of that. It's nothing that I connect with. In spite of that, this trilogy is still so great. Hobb's writing style is brilliant. Her characterization is as good as anybody in any genre. And I just love this series. The second and third book's probably a cut above the first book, but the series as a whole is an easy 5 stars, and I loved all 3 books. And part of the beauty of this overarching Realm of the Elderlings series that she's written, these 5 series together, is you could even start with this if you wished. I always think publication order is always king, so it's better to start with Farseer, but the 2 series are not connected except for one character who goes by a different name, and the only connections in this series to Farseer are really just small of the Easter egg type. So you could start with Live Ship Traders trilogy, which is, I think, a cut above Farseer, but I think they're both great and you should read both. I gave them both 5 stars. All right, on to the science fiction. Let's talk about this one up here, Dune. I'm not going to talk much because I've already produced some videos about Dune. I did a complete review of this book and then a review of the entire series where I ranked and rated the books. But my goodness, Dune is just one of the most vividly written science fiction tales I've read. Full stop. I love how he created this world. I love the people he created, the characters. I think it's just a home run of a book. I really enjoyed Dune. So although I didn't give the entire series a 5 out of 5, I think Dune as a novel is one of the most important works of science fiction. And if you like this genre, I don't think there are many must-reads, but I do think Dune might be one of those few must-reads in the science fiction genre. And this was a reread for me. And the first time I read it, I didn't rank it as high as I feel it is now. Right now, it's probably my favorite science fiction book ever. And I can't wait to even do a third read of this, within a year or two. But Dune by Frank Herbert, 5 stars, fantastic. Check it out if you're at all interested in that book, in that genre. One more book that I gave a top rating to in science fiction genre is Robots and Empire by Isaac Asimov. So I didn't feel that the Robots series as a whole was as good as the Foundation series. Foundation, those 7 books, I think are very, very, very strong. One of my, if not my favorite, science fiction series. It's definitely up there. And the Robots novels, the first 3, well, iRobot was a bunch of short stories, and then the 3 novels after that were kind of detective tales, just set in a futuristic Earth. Robots and Empire even skips further ahead, and I felt it was the strongest of all of the robot novels. The stakes were a lot higher, and even though it skipped ahead, so our Elijah Bailey from the first 3 books isn't with us because he can't live to be 200 years old, I found that this was the best of all of the robot tales. I hope to get to the Empire trilogy this year, just to kind of finish all of that Robot Empire Foundation series of Isaac Asimov's, which is one of the first multiverses in literature. But I did enjoy Robots and Empire. Although I read a lot of really good historical fiction this year, only one book got a 5-star rating in that genre this year. A lot of 4s, a lot of 4.5s, but the one book that transcended them all is Ken Follett's The Evening and the Morning. This is a prequel to Pillars of the Earth, which is one of my favorite books of all time, and one of the books that I find is the most universally loved books of all time. I've yet to meet somebody that's read Pillars of the Earth and hasn't said that they really enjoyed it, if not loved it, if not rank it as one of the best books they've ever read. Well, this is a prequel, and I think it's worthy. He wrote the 4 books in this series. He wrote Pillars, then he wrote 2 sequels, and then he wrote this one as a prequel. And I'll never say anything's as good as Pillars of the Earth. Well, I never say never, but it's hard for me to put something up there because the bar is so high, but this is really close. This is epic length historical fiction, which is something I've, come to love because of Ken Follett. And he's so great at character. He's so great at plotting and making a work this big just fly by. And I just love everything he does as far as creating this very believable world that leads up to the events of Pillars of the Earth. But if you like historical fiction and you like epic length historical fiction, I highly recommend the 4 books that Ken Follett has put in this Kingsbridge series. And I'd read them in publication order so that you do read Pillars. But these 4 books are fantastic, culminating with The Evening and the Morning, which was one of my 5-star books and the best work of historical fiction that I read this year. On to nonfiction. So I'm not sure if maybe because I don't read as much nonfiction, my scale is a little higher. I'm not really sure why, but I have a higher percentage of nonfiction books that rated 5 stars than any other genre. So maybe I don't have a good enough critical eye, or maybe I just read great nonfiction this year. But I have 6 works that I rated 5 stars that were nonfiction this year. So let's talk about these. The first would be Stephen King's On Writing. And this is part memoir, part manual on how to write. And only Stephen King could take that and turn it into a 5-star book for me. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed his stories about his first efforts at writing and his things that he did successfully, his failures. I also even enjoyed one part where he was showing part of one of his short stories, and he was showing the first draft and the things he did to tighten up the narrative. And he talks about all the things that he holds dear as far as being a writer and the things that he sees as universal truths to be a successful writer. I really enjoyed this short volume. And again, Stephen King is just such a wordsmith that he can take what is essentially not a very interesting topic for some and make it riveting. Although I'm one of the people that I enjoy this. I always enjoy seeing any artist talk about their craft. So seeing my favorite author talk about his craft was a 5-star rating for me. The next one that I rated 5 stars was this memoir by Maria Konnikova called The Biggest Bluff. How I Learned to Master Myself, Pay Attention, Master Myself, and Win. And this is the tale of Konnikova, who was a staff writer for The New Yorker, and she quit her job to play poker and write this book. And what's most fascinating is she had never played poker. It wasn't like this was something she was doing and decided to become a poker pro for a year. No, she just decided to quit and just do this. And she got a great mentor and learned what to do, how to be a great poker player. But mostly it was the mental things that she learned, how she learned to think through a situation, how she learned to think at the poker table about what she is doing, why someone else would do something, and to think through every situation, and then to take that and to put it into her own life. And along the way, she became a champion poker player. But more than that, she learned to read people and think about the motivations that people have, but more important, turn that lens on herself. And I just found the whole ride fascinating. And it was I think it was a bestseller this year, and it's something I enjoyed and gave 5 stars. Another 5-star book that I gave is one of the most bestsellers ever, and that's Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. And this isn't what I expected going in. I didn't know it was going to be a big meditation on grief and life and death. It's a really short read, and it's so powerful. I was just shocked by how moving this small little book was. And Mitch Albom's given us a great book about life and how to confront death through the eyes of his mentor, Morrie. And it's one that went down really quick, but stuck with me throughout the year. So Tuesdays with Morrie was one of my 5-star books of the year. Next up is Symphony for the City of the Dead by M.T. Anderson. This is a book about Dmitri Shostakovich and the Siege of Leningrad. I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about the Siege of Leningrad, or that it was several years. I'd known a little bit of Shostakovich's life. As a musician, he's someone I've studied, and music I've performed and conducted, and I've always found his music very at the forefront of what he went through in his life, and none more so than him writing his 7th Symphony while he was enduring this siege. The siege was brutal, and M.T. Anderson didn't shy away from some of the horrific things that happened, including cannibalism within this. How Shostakovich just wanted to write his music, and he would write and write and write, and then the air raid sirens would go off, and he would wait for the page to dry before he would go and shelter. And it's a very, very moving story, especially if you know the work. It's one that I think, though, if you don't know the 7th Symphony, you can read it and listen to it, and you can hear it. If you listen to the work, you can hear the moment that the Nazis come and enter Leningrad. You can hear it very clearly in the music, and I thought it was very, very well told. There were a couple historical, bits of naivete, but other than that, I still enjoyed this, which it was a finalist for a book award for narrative nonfiction work, and I really enjoyed Symphony for the City of the Dead by M.T. Anderson. My nonfiction book of the year was The Choice by Dr. Edith Eva Eger, and this is one of the finest works of nonfiction. It was my nonfiction book of the year, and it's about Dr. Eger's experience as an Auschwitz survivor, but not necessarily the horrors that she faced in Auschwitz, but more the horrors of trying to live after going through such a horrific act. You know, how can you possibly live after all of this, knowing all the people that died? You know, how do you have a right to continue and live a fruitful life? And it's so powerful, so powerful. It's about just the will to go on and the will to put horrible events behind you. And it's something that really stuck with me this year, The Choice by Dr. Edith Eva Eger. I only read one biography this year, and man, it was fantastic. And it was Pops, A Life of Louis Armstrong by Terry Teachout. I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I love a great biography, and I love when an author can bring an historical figure to life in such a way that is not just a dry retelling of facts, and Teachout does it brilliantly in this book. Pops is one of the finest biographies I've read. I'm a big jazz fan, but I think even if you're not a big fan of jazz or Louis Armstrong, I think that this is a book that a lot of people enjoy reading. All right, for me as a genre, a thriller rarely makes it to 5 stars. I think most of the very good ones for me are 4 or 4.5 stars, but I did read a 5-star one this year, and that was Fair Warning by Michael Connelly. If you've heard me talk about Michael Connelly, the thing that I always say about Michael Connelly is Michael Connelly can't write a bad book. And I've read like 35 of them, and they're all good. He's Mr. Consistent. And I think his 3 books that follow Jack McAvoy are his best. The Poet, The Scarecrow, and now Fair Warning. He has just a knack for just perfect plotting. Truly perfect plotting. I got into a discussion, I think I put this in my Goodreads review. I got into a discussion with a friend about thrillers and how great Connelly is at plotting, and he said, well, a lot of people are great at plotting. I said, well, Connelly's done it over 30 times, so I think he's the best because he does it every single time, and you don't have to go very far to read some other authors. Like, for instance, Lee Child, who I read 4 books of this year, he was only 3 for 4 in the plotting category. 75%. Connelly's like 35 for 35. He's so good, but I don't have enough superlatives for him. He's the best. I don't really read that many thrillers anymore. I have about 5 authors that I still continue, but Connelly is the one of the 5 that I pre-order everything that he writes because I know it'll be good. I know I'll enjoy it. All right, I did read one classic this year that goes into the 5-star category, and that was The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. This was my book of the year. If you saw my Red Fury Book Awards, this was my book of the year. It's so fantastic. Highly recommended. If you like works of the 19th century, or even if you don't, if you like revenge tales, or even if you don't, if you like classics, or even if you don't, Count of Monte Cristo is so great. It's the story of the Count. Early in the book, he is wrongfully imprisoned, gets out of prison, and then enacts revenge upon the people that put him there. And it's so well told, but thematically, at the very end of this book, the revenge takes a different, just a different direction that I think elevated this to, frankly, one of the best classics I've ever read, one of the best works of the 19th century I've ever read. Count of Monte Cristo, I love this book, and I hope that if even one of you decides to read it for my review, it'll make me really happy. But The Count of Monte Cristo is fantastic. Highly recommend it. All right, 2 more books that didn't fit into any of those categories that are in my other category that were 5 stars. The first is Hearts in Atlantis. You could categorize it as short stories, or you could categorize it as magical realism. I'm not really sure where it goes, but we have interconnected novellas and short stories that what for me made it great was it was a meditation on what it must have been like to live through the 1960s and all of the civil turmoil and everything that was going on in the 1960s. This is the first time I read something that made me feel what it must have felt like to live at that time. And I think that was its brilliance. And that was in the second story in this book is really, for me, what made this just fantastic. But I don't know why this is not one that is praised a lot more, because I did think it was so strong. And it was my best work of King that I read this year. And that's saying a lot. My favorite author, I read 5 of his. This was the best. And Hearts in Atlantis is a fine work. It's a meditation on the 1960s, the political, social, civil unrest that happened in that decade. If you want to read something about it and it'll make you feel like you're there, this book succeeds. And my last 5-star book of the year is one of the best books I read this year, and that is The Road. This was my best reread of the year. I reread some great books, including Hearts in Atlantis. But The Road is a post-apocalyptic novel that's bleak, and is just so profoundly powerful. I've talked about it many, many times, so I don't want to talk more here about it, but I will say that of all McCarthy's works that I've read, I think I've read 4 of them up to this point. This is the one that is just hits a home run, knocks it out of the park. His prose is perfect. The thematic idea of perseverance and just trying to survive is at the forefront, and it's just done so masterfully in this book. It's one of the most powerful books in the last few decades. The Road by Cormac McCarthy is my final 5-star book of the year. So that was my 2021. Sorry it's about a month late with this, but there were some other videos I wanted to get out earlier, like the read-along. I wanted to do the top 10 book series I wanted to read this year, so I wanted to get those out first. But I thank you for watching this far into the video. Let me know some things that were great that you read last year. Maybe I'll add it to my TBR. I would love to hear and talk with you in the comments below. But as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.